It's landlords, tenants, rent, and poker faces. You're watching Unbillable. It is not every day or every episode where the topic for the episode just jumps out to me like, hey, make Unbillable about me. But this episode, it really happened. I came across this story about Lady Gaga's father refusing to pay the rent on his restaurant and bar, and I was like, I gotta be able to turn that into an episode of Unbillable. And then as I was thinking about it, literally a friend called me who's in the commercial real estate business. I mean, he's shopping for a building right now, and started asking me about the Lady Gaga story, Lady Gaga's dad's story. And so next thing I know, I'm like, all right, we can do an episode of Unbillable about this. This is about business and real estate. This is about the intersection, literal intersection of business and real estate. The landlord is the owner of the building, the person who's invested in the actual real estate, the structure. And the tenant is the owner of the business, which is going to pay rent to the landlord to operate its business out of the landlord's building. It's business, the business of the tenant, and real estate, the real estate of the landlord. It's like a perfect topic for an episode of Unbillable. So let's get into it a little bit. I mean, if you think about it, a landlord and a tenant entering into a lease is really just a bunch of fancy words to say they're making a contract. And what does that contract say? Well, for the tenant, it's usually pretty simple. Pay the rent. Pay the rent. Pay the rent. One more thing. Pay the rent. That's right. You got to pay the rent. If you're the tenant, you got to pay the rent. Like the basic, the main, the almost only obligation you have. I don't want to say the only one because there are others. But the most important one is clearly, what was it? Pay the rent. Money talks. When it comes to landlord-tenant problems, and that's what we're going to get to in a second, it's money that talks. While we made clear that the tenant is responsible for paying the rent, what does the landlord have to do? Now, the landlord's obligation is a little bit more clear. The landlord has to make sure he abides by the terms of the lease. Now, again, what does that mean? It's a contract. The landlords usually, typically, it could be different for you, so make sure you check your lease. But typically, landlords are responsible for the roof and the exterior walls. That's pretty much it. Everything else is on the tenant, just the roof and the exterior walls. So if you have a leak, that would be the roof, and your landlord would be obligated to fix it. Now, what happens if your landlord doesn't fix it? What happens if your lease isn't clear on what are the obligations of the landlord? Well, that's how you become Lady Gaga's father. Wait, that's not how you become Lady Gaga's father. That's how you end up having the same dispute that Lady Gaga's father finds himself in. Lady Gaga's father owns Bird Whisky Bar, a restaurant and bar located in the Grand Central Station terminal. Bird Whisky Bar is the tenant. The landlord is the Grand Central Station. Now, there's a dispute that's been brewing that's made national news. Now, most landlord-tenant disputes don't make national news, but when you're Lady Gaga's father, at least that's what I think it's because of. This story hits the national news, and why isn't he paying his rent? Well, if you ask the landlord, it's because he's a deadbeat. In fact, the system sort of generally looks at tenants who don't pay the rent as deadbeats. Evictions, the process of removing possession from the tenant, possession of the space, and returning it to the landlord, right? Your right to hold the space is an expedited process. So what does that mean? If you're served a normal lawsuit, like a regular complaint, let's say for breach of contract for not paying back a loan or something like that, you have 30 days to respond. Again, that's sort of the general rules. Don't hold me to this stuff. But in an eviction process, if you're being evicted so the landlord can get a new tenant in the space, again, possession of the space is the issue, you only have 5 days from the date you're served to respond. So again, the court system is trying to expedite it so that people that don't pay their rent get kicked out quickly so that landlords can put the real estate to work for themselves by getting a new tenant who will pay the rent on time. Now, taking this back to Lady Gaga's father, his restaurant location in the Grand Central Station is having a problem with homelessness. Right? It's winter right now, and the homeless are using the terminal to kind of get out of the cold, number one, get in the warmth. Number two, they're also hitting up his customers for money, or like, maybe will you buy me some chicken? Maybe will you buy me a drink? Right? They're bothering, at least in the eyes of the tenant. In Lady Gaga's father's opinion, they're bothering his customers, right? By soliciting them for, kind of giving me some money, giving me some stuff. Number one. Number two, they're using the chairs. They're using the facility instead of having space for the diners. So like when you get your chicken or you get your drink, you turn around, you have nowhere to sit because all the homeless have filled up all the seats inside. Again, they're trying to escape the cold, right? And then number three, he has concerns that the bathrooms and the common areas are not being properly maintained. I think part of this has to do with the usage by the homeless people, but again, his point is that the common areas are not being maintained. The landlord responds very quickly quickly, very easily by saying, hey, look, 60 feet over there, there's another guy. He's doing just fine business-wise. This is all a bunch of baloney. But again, Lady Gaga's father has taken the position that these negative things, the homeless and the homeless people invading this space and areas, are negatively impacting his business. And so what is he doing about it? He's not paying his rent. That's right. He's decided to withhold some of his rent. Now, the dollar values are going to make the news because it's like over $260,000. But in reality, he's incurring rent at about a $50,000 a month clip. I believe rent is about $40,000 and there's about $10,000 in other fees. So this dispute, like $250,000 at least of it, could be incurred in just like a 5-month period. Now, maybe he's not paying all of the rent. Maybe he's only paying some of the rent. I don't know the specifics. But when you understand that it's like a $50,000 a month bill and he's behind $260,000, you see it's about a 5-month long dispute that this has been going on. Again, it might be longer, might be shorter. I'm not saying I know. I actually don't know for sure. I've never looked over the lease, but I'm just saying this is what he's doing as a tenant. He's using his money, his rent, as leverage in hopes of getting better conduct from his landlord. Now, I would tell you that this is not the right way to do it because what's the tenant's obligation? It's to pay the rent. And what is the deal? What is the lease? It's a contract. Does the contract say that he could do this? Does the contract allow for him to withhold payment of the rent until this problem is abated? It might, but it might not. And that's why we're going to talk about some solutions to how you can avoid this type of problem so you don't find yourself being Lady Gaga's father. Or wait, no, being Lady Gaga's father in the sense that you're a tenant in a building and you don't want to pay the rent because of problems that you believe are the landlord's fault. I wouldn't be doing my job if I wasn't teaching you or showing you or educating you on how to avoid the problem. Again, of course you can get in the problem and spend a bunch of money on attorneys. The landlord in this scenario is going to spend a lot of money on their lawyers to try to evict Lady Gaga's father. And Lady Gaga's father is probably going to spend a bunch of money on lawyers trying to fight off the eviction. The way you avoid this is negotiation. Remember, your lease is a contract. Try to negotiate on the front side before you enter in the lease. What would you negotiate? You might negotiate something that says, in the event of a defect in the condition of the facility, after providing notice to the landlord, the tenant has the right to repair and deduct those repair costs from the rent, right? That would give you, the tenant, the obligation to tell the landlord about the problem. It would give the landlord an opportunity to fix the problem, and if the landlord doesn't step up and fix it, then you as a tenant can fix it and pay those repair costs or whatever those expenses are to fix the problem and deduct those specific expenses from your rent. You would use the actual invoice and your payment of it along with your payment of the remaining balance of the rent to show that you're not a deadbeat, that you are paying the rent. You just had to send some of it somewhere else to fix the problem, right? This is something you could negotiate. Again, negotiate into your lease. Your lease is a contract. The terms can be negotiated. Another idea would be to effectively put a clause in the lease that says in the event of a defective condition, the landlord would have the obligation to be responsible for any lost business. Now, this would be a much harder provision to get a landlord to agree to, in my opinion, but you again could attempt to negotiate a provision that puts some of the burden of an interruption of your business back on the landlord, right? Again, it's about negotiating. It's about thinking of not just the good scenarios, but the bad scenarios at the beginning of your relationship, right? You got to kind of don your Darth Vader mask, or should I say your poker face, when you start to negotiate. You got Lady Gaga, right? So when you start to negotiate with your landlord, right? You need to negotiate these terms on the front end. Anticipate not just the good, but also the bad, the way I anticipating you hitting the subscribe button over there and clicking right down here for another episode of Unbillable.